Yoka, welcome to the Leanpub launch video for digital transformation and product culture, how to put technology at the center of your company's strategy. I was wondering if you could take a moment just to talk to us a little bit about your book and yourself and who the book is for.
Sure. Thanks for having me. The book is on my experience with digital transformation. I'm Brazilian, as you can see from my accent, and I have some interesting experience. My whole career was in tech companies, and my best two experience were on companies that were facing some sort of digital transformation, or how to use digital to improve their results, their experience they deliver to their customers, and their operations, their day-to-day operations. So I had a lot of learnings there. So I decided to put all that into a book. And the book is centered in the product culture that is based 4 principles to deliver a good product. And the 4 principles are you need to deliver early and often your product. You need to be focused on the problem to find the best solution. You need to deliver results. That's a bit obvious, I know, but we need to say it and make it explicit. And you need to have an ecosystem mindset, because normally companies have more than one client, and we need to pay attention to all of them. So this is the book.
Thanks very much for that really great description. The book is Digital Transformation and Product Culture. Check it out on Leanpub. It's really great. And thank you very much, Yoka, for taking the time to do this launch video with us.
Thank you.